Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I don't know whether you're like me, but my head is spinning in terms of the reflection, the opportunity to reflect on the meaning of spirituality, how that impacts across different disciplines. It's been wonderful listening to the keynote lectures around the different approaches to spirituality, and I think they've set the scene really well in terms of that understanding and that depth. So it's a real pleasure for me. I've had the opportunity to work with John and known John for a long time, and he laughed yesterday. He says, when I first saw you walking in Wilf, he said, I understand we're aging. I don't know.
I didn't mean it quite that.
I don't know what he meant by that. But I will forgive him. So it's a great privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor John Swinton, Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care and Chair in Divinity and Religious Studies at University of Aberdeen. He's the founder of the Centre for Spirituality, Health and Disability, and John probably doesn't need any introduction from me. He's published extensively in this field, in the field of healthcare and dementia and disability. I had the privilege of John examining my PhD, so I still survived and we still speak, so that was a good thing. So John's going to talk to us, his title of his presentation is Thickening Spirituality, Finding Depth Within the Spirituality and Health Conversation. I'm a big fan of John's work. He's been an inspiration, continues to be an inspiration, a pioneer in this field of spirituality. So I look forward to listening to what ingredients he's offering us in terms of how he's going to thicken this concept of spirituality. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Will. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I didn't mean you looked old. I just mean I'd known you for a long time, and I'd forgotten. Well, first of all, good morning. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation. It's really interesting, actually, coming to this meeting because Wilf and Linda Ross and I, many years ago, how long would it be, 15 years ago, maybe even longer, met together in London to put together this idea for a network focused on spirituality and healthcare, which then became ultimately the British Association for the Study of Spirituality, BAS, and which has now become this. So this is like the culmination of my history in a kind of way. I mean, other things have happened, it's not just this. I am a kind of sad guy, but not that sad. It's also really nice to see people or meet people that I've only met previously online, which is really interesting because it's good to see people. But everybody's much smaller when you meet them, right? So when you see somebody on the screen, you think they're going to be giants, and then, unlike me, because I'm a giant. Anyway, I wanted to think about spirituality in a particular way. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but organisations and institutions can have mental health challenges, right? So an organisation can be psychotic. So when you're inside that organisation, it feels fine, everything looks good. But anybody looking in knows that this is something wild going on in here. Organisations can be depressed, where everybody in there is just flat, no motivation, just absolutely grounded. Organisations, institutions can be neurotic, where everybody's anxious, everybody's tense, everybody's afraid that something horrible is going to happen. So there's kind of like an institutional culture that runs, an institutional psyche that runs through probably any organisation or any institution, particularly like healthcare organisations. But I wonder if you've ever thought that institutions, organisations also have spiritualities. They have inbuilt ways of thinking and working out what spirituality is. So if you think about something like the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, which provides care for all people, from the cradle to the grave. Right? So it's a huge range of people with a huge range of beliefs and a huge range of ways of seeing the world. Within that context, only a particular form of spirituality will work. And that's a spirituality that applies to everybody. In the same way as you can't have an antibiotic that works for one person, you can't have a spirituality that works only for one person. So the particularities of spirituality tend to be excluded from our understanding of what spirituality is. And so spirituality becomes the search for meaning and purpose and value and hope, and for some people, God. But it's always my meaning, my value, my purpose, and my hope. In other words, it reflects the individualism of culture as a form of spirituality. And within that institutional spirituality, there are some things that you can say and some things you can't say. Some things that you can push as important and some things you can't. And so you end up with a generic spirituality, which, if you like, a thin spirituality, which applies to all peoples and none, and all faiths and no faiths. Now, one of the interesting things, when you think about it in that way, is that people like us, or people like us in healthcare, who think we're taking spirituality into the institution, are actually finding our spirituality shaped by the institution. And so we end up with thin understandings of spirituality that actually miss out on really important aspects of what spirituality is and what spirituality looks like and what spirituality feels like. What I want us to do this morning is to try to thicken our understandings of spirituality. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. There's nothing wrong with thin understandings. They do good work. But a thicker understanding of spirituality takes us to some really interesting places. So I want to begin with the idea of thick and thin descriptions. Right. So the way that we describe the world is very, very important. Because the way you describe the world, the language you use, the descriptions you use, determines what you think you see. And what you think you see determines how you respond to what you think you see. So descriptions are really important because they have practical outcomes. So I want to think, first of all, about the idea of thick description. The idea of thick description comes from the anthropologist or ethnographer Clifford Geertz, who is trying to think, how can you capture the richness and the depth of another culture, in his case. And so this is what it is. Geertz borrows the concept of thick description from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle. He uses the example of a wink. The differentiation between a twitch and a wink. Two boys may rapidly contract their eyelids, thin description. In the first case, the contraction may just be involuntary. In the second case, the contraction may signify a conspirational message. Come on, let's steal the ice cream from the third boy in for us. So a wink can be mischievous, it can be malicious, it can be emotional, it can be loving, or it can just be the movement of your eyelid. So a thick description tries to capture these other dimensions of value, of meaning, of the hidden dimensions of what simple acts seem to be. Now, there's nothing wrong with thin descriptions in themselves, because a wink is a movement of your eye. And they can be very useful within a healthcare context. My good friend Stephen Pattison and I, many years ago, wrote a paper we were trying to work out how we could understand the huge diversity of definitions of spirituality in the nursing and medical literature. How can we make sense of that when it's such a diverse way of thinking about things, and nobody ever seems to say the same things? And so we came to the conclusion that actually, even though there's a huge diversity in the way that spirituality works itself out, these thin descriptions are helpful because they motivate us to behave in particular ways. So we thought, is it better to try to define spirituality conceptually, or is the point of spirituality in healthcare its function? Should we be asking the question, what is it? Or should we ask the question, what does it do? And we came to the conclusion that asking the question, what does it do, is probably more appropriate for a healthcare context. So a thin description, which really gives us the pragmatic dimensions of what spirituality does, can be helpful. So we said it's more useful to develop a thin and vague and functional understanding of what this word and its cognates might connote and do in the world of healthcare. And there's something important about that, because in healthcare, you're there to do things. Spirituality is there to do things, so it's a pragmatic concept. The task is to listen and to understand the function and direction of the language of spirituality, not to question its validity or right to exist, to be used. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about it. Rather than constantly arguing about what spirituality is, think about what it does, and then you can work out whether it's useful or not. And if it's not useful, then you don't use it. So the three questions that we asked, or conclusion we came to, the questions that we wanted people to ask in relation to spirituality was, does the area of human experience marked out by the terms spirituality, spiritual care, and their cognates have practical utility? Can patients benefit from healthcare professionals' adoption of usage of such language? If the language of spirituality does have practical utility, and if patients can and do benefit from the use of terms like spiritual and spiritual care, then how might the language of spirituality play out in the development of better ways of caring for individuals who are experiencing illness and facing death? So even a thin definition has important practical and perhaps therapeutic significance. But there's still a problem with thin definitions. First of all, they can become wholly defined by their practical utility. So in other words, all you're doing is looking to see whether this works or it doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, you reject it. And you reject things that don't fall within your worldview, don't fall within that pragmatic task that you're trying to engage in just now, so you push it away. So huge swathes of spirituality are ignored or pushed aside for the practical dimension. Because they're useful, we use them to confirm, disconfirm, or enhance what we already know. Right, so we already know what patients want. We already know what we want from this spirituality, so we'll use it in that way. So it reinforces the things that we already know. So the fact that spirituality might be able to bring a completely different dimension to what we already know is pushed to one side because we know what we need, and this is the way that spirituality can meet that particular need. Significant dimensions of the phenomenon are overlooked, misunderstood, or represented simplicitly. And that's that idea of that there are dimensions to what we're doing that we don't notice because we are pragmatically focused, that I want us to focus on today. Because a thick description draws our attention to aspects that a thin description really can't enable us to see. So a thin description of spirituality is something like this: the search for meaning, purpose, love, relationship, value, hope, dignity, and transcendence. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, because if spirituality tries to answer those big questions, who am I, where do I come from, where am I going to, and why, then these aspects of spirituality make perfect sense. But when you ask the question, what do these things actually look like, it becomes more complex and actually more interesting. What does meaning look like? What does transcendence look like? Then it becomes interesting. So rather than having thin concepts, let's thicken that. And I want to break down spirituality in order to build it up. So I want to focus on one aspect of spirituality today that I think helps us to look at various other aspects in a different way. That aspect is relationality, but I'll come back to that in 1 second. So the centrality of relationality is one thing that all definitions of spirituality have in common, that somehow spirituality has to do with connectedness, with relationships, with being together in a particular way, in a particular context. But when we think, what does relationality mean, and what does relationality look like, it's not as obvious as you think. Because we, particularly those of us who belong to a Western context, have a particular understanding of relationships. It's based on reciprocity very often. It's based on the fact that you give me social goods, I'll have social goods back, and then we'll be friends in that sense. So there's a kind of social exchange that goes on within our concept of relationships, which makes it difficult when we meet people who don't reciprocate relationships in the way that we think they do, we should do. What do we do? I'll come back to this in a second, but what do you do when you're with somebody with advanced dementia that's not giving you these social goods back? What does relationality look like in that situation where your cultural assumptions are challenged? What do you do? And very often what you do is withdraw, but I'll return to that. So I want to begin by thickening our understandings of health, because one of the obvious things for spirituality and healthcare. It contributes to our understanding of what health is and better healthcare practices. So how are we to understand health? Well, very often within a medical context, we understand health as the absence of illness. So we go to the doctor with, I'd say, something wrong with our chest. The doctor uses his or her X-ray machine, sees a dark spot in our lungs, then we use medical technology to excise that. So we move from health, ill health to back to health. And so health is understood as the absence of illness, which makes it very difficult for people who are living with enduring problems, enduring schizophrenia, or enduring rheumatoid arthritis, or whatever it is, because you're always ill in that sense. However, if we think about health slightly differently, something quite interesting happens. What is health and where do I find it? There's a lovely concept within the Judeo-Christian tradition called shalom. You may be familiar with it, like, and it means peace. Sometimes it's used as a blessing, so you meet somebody and say, shalom, peace to you. But the actual core meanings of shalom are really important. Shalom means peace with God, ultimately, peace with one another, and peace with creation. So it's a big, beautiful, holistic peace within which you are at one peace with all of these dimensions. And within that, the understanding that the understanding of health that emerges from that is that health is not necessarily to be freed from your ailment or your illness. It's to be at one and at peace with God, one another, and with creation. So you could be somebody who is a fantastic athlete standing on your Olympic podium with your medals swaying backwards and forwards, and you can be really unhealthy because you have no peace with God, you have no peace with one another, you only peace with yourself, and it's only a fragile peace because you lose the next race. And you can be lying on your deathbed and be completely peaceful, completely healthy in that sense. So that idea of health within illness is really important because in that context, healing becomes understood as connection. And as soon as you think about healing as connection, you can begin to see how spirituality functions. It connects you with yourself. It connects you with your God. It connects you with creation. And you see the same dynamic in the recovery movement within mental health, where service users have taken that idea of recovery away from psychiatry and placed it in a different context. That recovery means living well, even in the midst of the situation that I'm in. So instead of thinking, well, voices are simply a symptom of an underlying pathology, the question is, how do I live well with voices? Well, and I will touch on that again later on. But you see what I'm saying? It's health within illness. I think when that space is opened up, then spirituality becomes significant. So health is not the absence of anything. It's the presence of God and the experience of meaning, purpose, hope, value, and love, even amid the wildest of storms. So relationality. This is where I want us to push into. And I'll begin with a story. A few years ago, I'm a theologian, and I don't say that as an apology, because I saw somebody going, oh, that's a shame. You can get ointment for that, you know. And a few years ago, I did a study. It was a phenomenological study. By that I mean that phenomenology suggests that you, when you're looking at something, you put to one side your natural assumptions about what that thing is. And so it was a study of the spiritual lives of Christians living with major mental health challenges, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. And so my task was to put to one side the normal associations that you have with diagnostic criterion and the normal cultural associations you have with something like schizophrenia, that it was split personalities, all these things that are completely untrue, but that are part of that cultural construction of that particular area. Put that to one side and listen to people's stories. And when you listen to people's stories, it's absolutely fascinating because you get a completely different perspective on the way the world is. And so Alan's story, I think, will get us into that space where we can thicken our understanding of relationality and then thicken our understanding of spirituality. So Alan, well, I first met Alan when he was actually a divinity student. So he studied with me in Aberdeen many years ago. And I met him again several years later as I was interviewing for this project. So Alan lived with schizophrenia, and he was relatively late on in his life before he was diagnosed, but he had quite a journey. And he told me many things, but one of the most striking things that he told me was the story that when he got his diagnosis. So he got his diagnosis. So he had said to me, I've been experiencing these strange experiences. I've been hearing voices, I've been seeing things. I feel that people are against me. And I know I've been really troubled by this for months and months. And he said, my mum said, you need to go and get help, Alan. And so he did. So he went to the local, he went to the GP, and then he ended up with a psychiatrist in his local mental health hospital. And he went through the various tests that people do to work out what his diagnosis is. And he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he says he remembers it very well. He says, the psychiatrist said to me, Alan, you have schizophrenia. Right? And he said, as soon as I heard these words, I knew my life was over. He said, I'm not going to have any friends. I'm never going to get a girlfriend. I'm never going to get married. I'm not going to have a job. I'm not going to be accepted by society. And think about it. 3 words. You have schizophrenia. And suddenly his whole world collapses in on him. And so he went back home, and he sat down on the bus beside a woman who he travelled with many times. And he told her the story. He said to her, I have schizophrenia. And immediately she got up off the bus, and they never talked again. And so he went home, and he told his mum this, because he was absolutely devastated at this point. He told his mum this story. And his mum said this. His mum said, Alan, you have schizophrenia. You're not a schizophrenic. I love you. Right? So 3 words, I love you. And he said, at that moment I knew I had hope. That moment I knew that I probably could continue my life. In that moment I knew that I was part of something. Even though that I still had these fears, I felt I belonged. So these 3 words, I love you, countered the other words, you have schizophrenia, and everything that went with that. Now it seems to me that there's something very, very important in there about the nature of spirituality, particularly in a healthcare context, where a mental health care context in particular, where all of these stigmatic meanings associate around an individual. The simple idea that it's spiritual care has to do with saying, I love you, or I care for you, or you are worthwhile being connected with, I think is fundamentally important. So hold Alan's story in mind as we move on. Now, I'm going to show you this little bit of video, I hope.
Babies this young.
So I need volume in this. Oh, I think it's not coming through the... Is it coming through? Oh, okay. All right. There we go.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the right hand side social
Say again. Oh, is that stair there?
Now, where's the slide again?
Next
Sorry,
one.
next one. Here. Which is at maximum volume. Yeah, it's at maximum volume.
Yeah, what about the control panel? Control panel?
At maximum too. 100%.
It's all right.
Just try it again then, so sorry now.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So you can say the point being that we're hardwired for relationships, right? And when these relationships are frustrated, that's the beginning of the kind of troubles that we encounter. But later on in life, if we still meet still faces in the way that Alan does, then you have that constant traumatization. So something very important about connectivity and about the way in which stigma, for example, in mental health causes still faces, which exacerbates already difficult situations. And so that sense of relationality is fundamental for understanding who we are as human beings, but also how we respond to one another as human beings and why we respond to particular people in particular ways. Now, the spiritual dimensions that are very important. This is a picture of my good friend David Hay, who worked with me for many years in the Centre for Spirituality, Health and Disability at the University of Aberdeen that Wolf mentioned. David's a zoologist, and he had this theory that human beings are hardwired for spiritual experience. So it was zoology, and also his interest in psychology and child development. He had this hypothesis, and I thought, how can I test this hypothesis? And in this fascinating book called The Spirit of the Child, he begins to test that hypothesis. He says, well, if we are hardwired for relationships, ultimately if we're hardwired for spirituality, then where will we find that? And he says, we'll find it in children. Before they move into society, culture, before they're enculturated with particular ways of thinking about the world, we might well discover that here is an inherent spirituality. And so in the book, The Spirit of the Child, he does this lovely piece of qualitative research with young people, and he develops a fantastic method to try to get a sense of how they encounter the world. And sure enough, he discovers that children have a natural sense of awe, a natural sense of wonder, and a desire to connect with other people. And he says that this is the essence of what spirituality is. Some people, he says, manifest that in religion, but all of us are always searching for that. And he calls this thing, this desire to connect, relational consciousness. The desire to reach beyond yourself to connect with somebody else at a temporal or a transcendent level. And he says this is the essence of spirituality. It's always pushing in there. And so you should always be looking for it. But he also noticed something I think is important, that the way in which we educate children within Western societies, he suggests, despiritualizes people. So you have a natural sense of awe and wonder and a desire to connect. You go into the educational system, and the system says, yeah, these things are important, but not as important as science, facts, this particular ways of looking at the world, which break things down, look things down here rather than connect. And so things like ethics, morality, religion, spirituality are downgraded. And so then when kids get into their adolescence, very often they still have this natural desire to connect, but it's frustrated because of the way that they've been taught. And so he says that there's a real danger of enculturating people. And there's a real danger of doing the same thing within healthcare systems. If we have a thin understanding of what spirituality is, then one of the things that we might miss is the emergence of relational consciousness as people encounter the world differently through illness. Myself and an oncologist in Aberdeen did a study a few years ago on women who live with breast cancer during the first year after diagnosis. And we had David Hayes' theory in mind, because the way in which women adjust to the diagnosis during the first 3 months has a significant impact on their mental health later on. And so we wanted to see whether or not this idea of relational consciousness made any sense in the midst of that. And it was very clear that as we spoke to these women, that the experience of the diagnosis of breast cancer brought out a change. First of all, an internal change, because your identity changes as soon as you have a diagnosis. In particular diagnosis, it questions your mortality. And so therefore you have a whole lot of internal work to do. But then the next step is people reach out and suddenly they realize they're part of a deeply complex relational network. They started to think about their friends differently. They started to think about their children differently. They started to think about the whole of their community differently. And they realized their situatedness in that. And for some people, they started to think about God and the transcendent. And so in times of crisis, this relational consciousness, at least in that study, comes to the fore. Now, if you've got a system that doesn't notice that, and if you get staff that are not trained to see that, then it will get closed down again. And a significant aspect of healing in the way that we've been talking about gets closed down. So relational consciousness is interesting. And of course, that's why the pandemic was so relationally and spiritually devastating. Now, can you imagine spending months and months and months without seeing anybody's face? I mean, the impact of that, I think, is completely undervalued, both psychologically and spiritually. That something very important happened then, and something very important needs to be fixed. Because what the psychologist there said was, it's damaging to have that kind of relational damage, but it's fixable through positive experiences. So where do we get our ideas about what relationships are from? So I'm thinking about, we're working with a broad range of people in a healthcare context, but we tend to have a very kind of romantic understanding of what relationships are. However, when we think a little bit more broadly, I'm going to read you a little bit of something that I think you'll find interesting. There's a fascinating paper by bear with me. Fascinating paper by a theologian called Christine Guth. Now she's fascinating because she, my iPad's decided not to work. There we go. She wrote this paper called Horses Live to Run. And she talks about the idea of relationality and how all of her life she assumed that relationships were kind of loving and caring and tender until she got married. It's It's not quite the way I meant that. This is you can be my therapy group. That's what you call a Freudian slip, I think. But it wasn't until she got married, because something was strange within our relationship, she said. She said, long before we had a name for it, long before we had a name for it, Asperger's was already colouring Bob, her husband's, relationship. During our courtship, Bob and I had cause to live. Oh, can't believe it. Just bear with me 1 second. There we go. See, technology is lovely. Okay, here we go. During our courtship, Bob and I had time together. But I noticed something different about Bob. He had no time for romance. He had no time for hugs and kisses. He had no time for roses. For Bob, romance came in routine. If I kept the same routine day by day, if I kept the room in the same space in the same way day by day, if I made sure that his sandwiches were in the fridge day by day, then we were in love. And I realized that my little Asperger's family challenged me with my understandings of what love was and what love looked like. For Bob, just sitting at night talking about the day was the same as a hug. For Bob, simply sitting together in silence because noise was troublesome was as good as a kiss. And I began to learn that my understanding of relationships, my understanding of love, my understanding of what spirituality was ultimately, was very, very different from that which I've expected, but very, very beautiful, because Bob is the one that I love. So there's something lovely about that. That if we can get past our cultural understanding and assumptions about what relationships are, if we can thicken our understandings, then we can begin to see the depth and the breadth of our humanness. Because when you begin to encounter people like Christian and Bob, it expands your understanding of what humanness is, expands your understanding of what spirituality looks like, and expands your understanding and possibilities of being together in complex situations. And so, one last thing on relationships. I mentioned earlier on the recovery movement, and it's important. The recovery movement tries to reframe our understanding in relation to mental health, to challenge the way that we think about the world. So, for example, if you think about the area of hearing voices is fascinating. Did you know that depending on what studies you look at, anything up to 18% of the non-psychiatric population hear voices? Most of the voice hearing that goes on within society actually goes on outside of established mental health services. People hear voices all the time. The key is how you manage them and how you are able to live well with them. But in my own story, in my own research, I came across a lady called Alice, who was a fascinating lady. And she, again, lived with schizophrenia. And she talked very eloquently about voices. And she talked about the way in which, when she heard voices, she oftentimes heard two sets of voices, one saying nasty things to her, one saying peaceful things to her. And sometimes her head was just filled with this. But in the midst of that cacophony of voices, there was one voice, she said, that she had a particular relationship with. And she had a name for that voice. And that voice would mediate between the other voices. And so she became attached to that. They became friends. And then eventually, when she was in her early 20s, most of the symptoms of schizophrenia left her. She put that down to a supernatural healing. Her psychologist put it down to misdiagnosis. So somewhere in between lies the truth. anyway, either way, one of the things that, at one level, she was delighted that the voices had disappeared. But at another level, she wasn't, because the first thing that struck her was she was lonely. Right? Better, she put it, better to be surrounded by a cacophony of voices than to be surrounded by nobody at all. But more than that, she discovered she had to grieve for this friend. So she had this dilemma now of having to grieve for a friend that never existed, and having to tell people that she's grieving for a friend that never existed. Because if she tells a psychologist, he's going to think she's psychotic again. But for her, it was profoundly important. Because one of the things that perhaps we don't always think about is when it's something like voices, it's not just simply a symptom, it's actually very often a series of relationships. And so even when sometimes when you hear when people go on medication, particularly for the first time, it damps down their voices. But that sense of loneliness still is there. And part of that loneliness is to do with the stigma, the fact that you actually don't have any physical friends. But part of that loneliness has to do with the relationship that people have with their voices. So when we talk about relationality, and when we talk about relationality in the context of spirituality, these complexifying factors are really, really important. Because for Alice, it's not, relationality doesn't simply mean let's sit down and have a good relationship with you. It means understanding, empathizing with the whole of that complex situation that she finds herself in. And so when you thicken the understanding of relationality, interesting things begin to happen. So relationships provide meaning, purpose, hope, and value. However, relationships are much more complicated than we might think. If we were to place relationships at the center of our understanding of spirituality and spiritual care, we need to consider the wide variety of relationships that people experience. When we do that, we're able to be present with people. And as I just come to the end of what I'm going to say to you just now, it's that idea of being present that I want us to focus on. Past that. So presence is a central aspect of spirituality and spiritual care. It's a particular mode of relationality. When I was, just before the pandemic, I was on sabbatical in Australia, working with an organisation in Sydney. And they had asked me to do a piece of research on carer presence, because they had just had a royal commission that pointed out that and there's been a series of abuses in elder care. And the royal commission pointed out that one of the problems that people encountered was that carers weren't present, right? So they'd be in a room, and they'd be with somebody, but they'd be on their phone or they'd be talking across them. So they'd be present but not present in that sense. And they wanted me to have a look at to see what that is. And basically, long story short, when you're with somebody who's with advanced dementia and you're not getting the social goods that I mentioned earlier on, the simplest thing to do is to withdraw or pretend that that person is no longer a person. And as soon as you do that, that's when you get a culture of potential that has a potential for abuse in there. But it made me think about the whole area of presence. So we have a culture of busyness where busyness becomes a badge of honour, right? So if everybody I speak to recently who is retired, I say to them, "How are you?" And they say, "I'm busier than ever." And I'm thinking, when I retire, I don't want to be busier than ever. But the reason that is because culturally busyness is a good thing in that sense, even though it's an unhealthy thing. But we also have a culture of absence. Now think about it, it's partly a social media thing, not wholly. 4 people sitting around a dinner table, all on their phones, one person in Vietnam, one person in the United States, everybody in the same room, but nobody actually present with one another in that sense. And so we're getting used to that. But let me give you some statistics. We check our phones every 12 minutes during waking hours. I'm sure you don't. 7% of us say we never turn our phones off. 40% of us check our phones within 5 minutes of waking. Actually, I check my phone immediately awake, so I'm very guilty of that. A recent study noted that those people who are distanced by email and phone calls saw a 10-point fall in their IQ, which was twice that found in the impact of smoking marijuana. So it's actually safer to smoke marijuana than to use your phone. But I don't recommend either, I hasten to add. And then there's this idea of continual partial attention, where you're always checking your social media, not because you're expecting anything, but you just don't want to miss out on anything. I was just speaking to Robin yesterday. I'm very prone to that. So, yeah. But the point is that culturally, we're becoming people who are used to being absent. You take that into an aged care context, take that into a healthcare context, and you can see the obvious consequences. So one of the things that a thick description of relationality does is it helps us to be present in that sense. But the problem is, culturally, we're losing our sense of spiritual connection. I think that's really, really important. We're getting used to not being connected. I mean, we're individual society, and so it's been happening for a long time, but more and more we're being used to being individuals. And so it's difficult for us to think about connectedness. And it's difficult for us to think about that big connectedness with God, with one another, with creation. And that bottom one, connected with creation, or connected with the world, is really, really important. There's a relatively new diagnosis, but it's not actually formally a diagnosis, but it's a concept that's been developed called solastalgia. Solastalgia emerged from research on Indigenous people in Australia, where they were still in the same geographical space, but because of the destruction of their environment, they no longer felt at home. So they felt homeless, they felt displaced. And the idea of solastalgia actually is becoming more and more apparent, particularly amongst younger people, that people no longer feel that they're at home. They don't feel there's a safe place. So solastalgia leads to anxiety, to depression, to a sense of meaninglessness in that sense, to that bottom realm of shalom where we should be connected to the world. We're actually not. And there's all sorts of health consequences that are emerging from that. So I think, the conference and the title ends in uncertain world. I think solastalgia reminds us that on the grander scheme of things, spiritual care, spirituality has global implications, has ecological implications that manifest themselves in our health and in the ways in which we discover and encounter one another and remain healthy. So finally, thick descriptions of spirituality, they allow us to be present. They allow us to be present in the world. They allow us to be present with one another. They allow us to be present with our transcendent dimensions of our lives, and they allow us to be present with ourselves. Thin descriptions do good work, but thick descriptions open up a whole universe within which we can see not only healthcare differently, but actually the world quite differently. So, I'm finished. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, John, for sharing your wisdom, your insights, your narratives, your stories, and for illuminating shiftness from that thin description of spirituality to that thick description. But I want to present you with a challenge.
Oh dear.
Yeah. In terms of healthcare, why is there so much resistance to adopting not just the thin descriptions, but even trying to develop a thick description within that context? Why is there such, what can we say, there's a resistance and there's an inability to accept the impact of what you're saying in terms of the impact on health, well-being, the impact on the whole person. So what is that? How can we overcome that resistance? How can we get this thick description embedded?
Well, I think one of the problems, I think, is time. That we live in the healthcare systems are highly pressurized, like where short-term pragmatic concepts actually function well and are what people look at. So it's much easier, for example, if somebody has schizophrenia or to stick with that, to medicate rather than to contemplate. Because you just haven't got the time or the space or the staff to be able to do that. So I think the system itself constricts the possible options for thick descriptions. But by doing that, the danger is it actually inflicts ill health on people. But it looks as if it's fixing things, but not fixing things. No. But I think it's just constraints to the system. It's that's at the root of that.
Yeah, thank you. Open to questions.
Morning, John.
Good morning.
I loved that. Thank you very much. My name is Vivian Brady. I showed that video, the still face, to my first year student midwives. I was so delighted to see you talk about it, and what you're saying is so important. My question, I suppose, is that there's a lot of trauma around birth, nationally, internationally, and I wonder how, if we are able and ready for a relationship ourselves and the person we meet isn't, how do we cope with that? You know, if you're a baby whose mother is too unwell or too traumatized to connect with you, you know, how do we get past that? That's a big question, isn't it? But I put it to you anyway. Thank you.
Oh, you'd have to put that to a psychologist. I'm not sure, but I mean, I think the key would be, if you're working in a midwifery kind of context, like to know that, to recognise the significance and the impact of that. So if a mother is not able to give that kind of mirror, and then I guess supporting her and helping her to recognise that. But I think for staff to be aware that this is actually a highly significant thing, psychologically rather than just physically, is maybe the beginning point. So I don't know what the answer to your question is like, but I think awareness of the issue and the significance of face is probably the beginning point for finding solutions.
Thank you, Nasreen Lalani. I'm from Purdue University, USA. It was a wonderful presentation. Most of my research is around family caregivers, and I remember one of the family caregivers saying that when healthcare providers don't give us a listening ear or give us presence, then everything seems like falling apart. So I can internalize it from the depth of my heart, that is very important. But I do absolutely agree with you that with the technological advancements, and now healthcare facilities using more of telehealth and other technology to connect people. So when we talk about relational spirituality, and all those kind of things that you mentioned, so how do we see that paradigm shift in a technological world? I remember that Jen Watson is also starting talking about it, and she has developed some of the competencies for providers using the technology. But then how do you see that relational spirituality coming up? Because even in our home settings with our kids also, and as a teacher also, when I teach online classes, it becomes very difficult for me to provide that presence and establish that relational spirituality. So how do you see that paradigm shift, and what could be done? What would be your recommendations for providers to build that kind of relational spirituality with their patients or the families?
Well, there's a couple of things I would say to that. One, I mean, technology is very helpful. And with the pandemic without electronic technology would have been quite unthinkable in some senses. And so there's lots of lessons that we've learned from that. I think it is possible to develop intimate relationships through electronic communication. I think it's a skill that needs to be learned. I don't think you can just switch on your screen and then do it. And so I think that there's a scope for a strategy of education that focuses on how do you communicate effectively, bodily and emotionally through electronic technology. I think for the most part at the moment people just go and do it. But I think there is a strategy, and I think you could have a spiritual strategy to begin to do that. But the other side of that is, at the end of it, you switch off the screen. So there's always that thing about endings. Like, it's like when you phone home in a hotel room, like you switch off the screen and you're still in your hotel room. So it's not really a spiritual environment, but we could do better. However, having spent some time speaking with people who live with autism and people who live with dementia through the pandemic, one of the things that many people really enjoyed was Zoom church, right? So they would Zoom in on a Sunday to the religious community, and they would participate, right? Now, the nice thing is there that none of the normal distractions are there. So you don't have the normal, come on, I'll hug you person, or you don't have any smells or anything else like. And so they said that for the first time they felt part of the community, because the things that many other people would say were a distraction were actually perfect for them now. So I think at least part of your conversation is broadening the conversation around that to include different kinds of people in relation to how that mode of communication works and seeing what that looks like.
Hi, John. That was wonderful. Thank you. My name's Hannah Freeble-Gabbett from Melbourne, Australia. I work as a lived experience consultant, and I'm almost finished my training as a spiritual care mental health practitioner. I'm really moved by your presentation, and I'm wondering around the applications for young people, because young people today are facing a lot of challenges around their mental health, and they're losing their religion as well, therefore losing their communities. And so I'm wondering around this model and, you know, whether you have any considerations for the young people.
Well, I can speak as a young person, if that's what you mean. Why are you laughing? Say spirituality and then humiliate the speaker. I don't know if I have. I think in relation to religion, which I think you're speaking about, one of the problems with young people in religion is not so much the message that religion has as the way in which religion is oftentimes delivered. So I think you've got a problem with the actual modus operandi of religion sometimes. Like that, combined with the continual religious scandals that go on in terms of leadership, means that it's very difficult to speak constructively and safely about religion in that sense. But the central core issue of all religions remains extremely important. Like. So I think, depending on what your context, so if you're talking to people, young people, I'm presuming you're talking about yourself.
Well, the generation that I represent, yeah.
Our generation. Then I think that perhaps your task is to extrapolate the essence of good religious traditions from the trappings of good religious traditions and help people to live it. Because I think it's when you live it, then that becomes significant rather than when you think about it or when you ritualize it. I suppose that's your task, is to separate the wheat from the chaff. Good luck.
So, John, the presence. I noticed as you moved from thin to thicker definitions, you at the same time invoked a lot of psychology, transpersonal psychology, social psychology, and you brought in the existing dimensions of spirituality as well. Now we can see the value of doing that, but at the same time, when you so blur the edges, one might call it a transdisciplinary approach or something. But we also, at the same time, I think, face the danger of losing the value added of what spirituality brings. And I got a sense that you were doing that. How do you react to that kind of broadening and bringing in so much transpersonal social psychology, the psychology of relationships, and at the same time seem to be calling it the value added of spirituality?
Exactly. And that's the problem, isn't it? Because one of the big challenges in relation to spirituality is exactly your problem. Like, what makes it not psychology, or what makes it not positive thinking? Like, however, I see human beings as embodied creatures. Human beings who cannot understand the world apart from their psychology, apart from the way in which they see and think and feel the world in it. And spirituality is not apart from that. So spirituality functions and makes sense through your bodily functions. So I don't see it as a blurring of the edges if I talk about psychology, because I see it as part of my embodied self, in the same way as spirituality is part of my embodied self in that sense. So by breaking it down, I can help to focus on different areas. But it's just the term blurring suggests that there's a core concept of spirituality. And I think when you look at the way in which spirituality is defined, that core concept is actually very broad. So I'm speaking into a broad concept anyway, within which I think recognizing the embodiedness and the interdisciplinary nature of human beings is a significant aspect of what it means to be a spiritual being.
Thank you, John.
I'm coming.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at that step there. Everybody falls in that step.
Sorry.
I'm not going up there ever again.
Hello.
Yes,
sorry,
sir.
John. Peter over here. Two questions really that come out from your talk, and they're related to the previous one. One is about the limits of relational consciousness. I mean, you referred to relationship with the earth. And I think a lot of people, not least Pope Francis, would want to talk about relationality as being at the heart of a spirituality for everything, and again against a technological use of things towards a relationship of things. And are you okay with that as an expression? And then the next related one is around where are the limits to that? And this comes out of Alice's story, really. So if somebody has an intense relationship with a chatbot on an insurance site, is that part of relational consciousness? Or a family member of mine feels guilty if they don't use a particular mug often enough because they feel it will feel unwanted. Is that also an authentic relational consciousness? And if not, then where do we draw the line on that, if you like? Might not be one that you can answer in theory, but be interested to hear.
Well, the way I would frame that is that that's a very complicated question, in the sense that what you're really saying is, should I trust Alice's word? In the sense that, okay, let me take that back. No, let me leave it there. No, let me take it back. Let me put it this way. Who determines what a good relationship is and with what is what you're suggesting there? And you're right to raise that, I think, in relation to a robot, a non-human object. That there is a question about whether the kind of relational consciousness that David Hay talks about relates to an inanimate object, even though it's technically animated. Whereas if somebody like Alice's situation, where she's having relationships with or racial experiences that are out with the norm, the temptation then would be simply to say that to take a certain criterion from psychiatry and then apply it to Alice's situation and then invalidate that experience. So my problem would be with the invalidation of a human being's experiences as opposed to the invalidation of a human being's experiences with a robot. I think that they're two different things. To talk about a human relationship with a human being, to talk about a human relationship with an inanimate object is a different kind in that sense. Which I know is not a fantastic answer to your question. I'm going to catch you later on because so I apologise for the vagueness of that, but I take your point.
Hello, I really enjoyed your talk and love your accent and your shirt. Your shirt is amazing.
Actually, I don't have an accent.
I'm a big fan of the Scottish. But my question is, I came across something, I'm a history buff, and it was curious because during World War II in France, there was something written once about these doctors who had been helping people when it comes to healing and healthcare. And in the French culture, which I'm pretty familiar with, is that in the old culture, a doctor was a healer, and it was a calling. It was something that it was understood. It was almost like it didn't matter if you were a doctor or a nurse or whatever. You were helping people to heal and guiding through this healing process. And my question is, I'm surprised that we in the Western world have taken so long to develop this kind of like recognition of the spirituality in the healing process. And for instance, when it comes to people who have near-death experiences is a great example. It's like you can treat it from a psychological point of view, or you could treat it from a spiritual point of view. Much of what you were saying, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the future of healing, and do you see a way to incorporate spirituality into the healing process, a clinic or a place where people can rest and get this healing? I'm just surprised that we haven't paid attention to this until now, but this is such a big need for this, is for a place to go, and it's not just, it's a combination of things to help a person heal. But I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that there is a lot of movement within medicine and within nursing to incorporate spirituality in the way that you think about it, the way you're describing it. So, for example, I'm involved with a medical school program in North Carolina just now, and what they're doing is developing a course for mental health professionals to help them to reframe and rethink their understanding of health and healing within a mental health context in exactly the way that you're talking about. The hope being that they can then become people who can transform the system. So you transform individuals and then they take that back and transform the system. And within that context, medical education is an aspect of that. So the idea would be that that you begin your training with this as a natural part of your practice. So another example would be at Aberdeen, we have a course called Spirituality, Health and Healing, and it brings together medics, nurses and divinity students for 11 weeks to discuss issues around health, spirituality, health and healing. And it's funny, when they first come in, right, so medics come in and they see the world as from a scientific perspective, the meaning of life is a randomized controlled trial, right? So the only way that you can find truth is by a particular scientific method. Nurses come in, and on the whole, they think they're not so keen in theory, but they like practice because they want to fix things, and that's not a bad thing. And divinity students, they think they already know because Jesus has told them. And so, but by the end of these 11 weeks together, they actually all share their own perspectives. And they understand that illness is a story, that medicine is to do with healing and all these things. However, as soon as the medics go back to the hospital, it's closed down because the consultant says, we haven't got time for this kind of mumbo-jumbo kind of stuff. So it's a problem because you can educate people as much as you want, but when you get back into practice, and if the system itself isn't set up to think that way, then it's always going to be a problem. But I would remain hopeful because I think these things are fundamental to good practice.
So I'm an extrovert, and extroverts think as they talk rather than before they talk. But my question relates to this notion of voices. In the story that you told about the man who had schizophrenia. And so it strikes me that in spirituality work, we're trying to get people to listen to the still small voice, their authentic voice. And then we're also dealing with people that, hear not so healthy voices. And I'm mostly a professor, but I also work as a part-time chaplain. And I had somebody the other day who thought he was possessed by a demon. So I'm like, oh boy, how do I deal with this? On my way into his room. And so the best thing that I could think of to say was, imagine that you have an unwanted guest at your house and you tell the guest to leave because they're not really useful. So and he couldn't really argue with that. So just imagine that the demon is a guest and tell him he can't live here. He's not welcome here, or she, whatever the demon is. So I guess my question is, there is a part of spirituality, and I keep thinking of that movie with Tom Hanks in it, where he was on an island, I forget what it's called, and he had a soccer ball.
Castaway.
Wilson, that he developed this relationship with the soccer ball and talked to the soccer ball, and I think listened to the soccer ball. But he clearly didn't, I don't know if he clearly didn't have schizophrenia. I guess my question is how do you help people distinguish the healthy, still small voices in spiritual work from the ones that aren't healthy? I know that's a really hard question.
Exactly. I mean, my point in that story, and I think the key point is that something like voices, it's not simply a symptom, it's a meaningful experience for the individual, and that we should look at it in that perspective. Teasing out the complexities of how you deal with that is something that the mental health professionals do, but my point would also apply to mental health professionals, that they should be thinking in terms of meaning and the meaning of voice and the meaning of the relationships, rather than simply let's eradicate the symptoms, because I think that's just not particularly helpful. So the answer to your question would be that would be a professional task to tease that out. But in conjunction with the chaplain, for example, there's no reason why, if you have a good collaboration between the two, you can't work together to work out what the spiritual core of that actually is.
I'm just conscious of time. Is what? Brief question.
Thank you.
Oh, hiya.
Hi, John. I want to say thank you, and also I'm really relieved to hear this talked about. So I'm Claire Brockett from Australia, and I work in aged care, overseeing strategic embedding of a spirituality framework. I'm really interested, John, if you know of any work done around embedding a thickened understanding of spirituality in aged care or health, linking a little bit to Wilf's question, because to me this thick space is about understanding and giving voice to the nuance and the complexity of spirituality, but on the ground in the working sense, you know, people are keen for that sharp, easy to understand definition, that simple time off the ground is difficult for training, experiential is difficult. If you know of, have you done any work in?
No, I haven't done any work. I mean, the kind of place to look would be in personal narratives, actually. So, like Christine Bryden's books and Christine Bryden's stories are good examples of thick descriptions of dementia, within which the medical approach is understood, but it's not definitive. And so, I don't think, to my knowledge, anybody's named it in that way and is working in that way. But I think you'll probably find you can get to that through narratives. Like Christine's.
Yeah, thanks.
So thank you, John. Thanks again for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom and your humour.